Welcome to the Dyno! We've got fun and games, and we're gonna take you behind the scenes in how we handle our hunt for horsepower. This is going to be a very special episode of Engine Masters, kind of like the Brady Bunch Goes to Hawaii, but a different kind of vacation, because I'm going to do my best to put you in our shoes to see what it's like to go behind the scenes for a day at the dyno here at West Tech Performance Group in Mira Loma, California. What we're going to do is show you how you would show up with your engine prepared, why you would want to come to the dyno with your engine to begin with, how you hang it on the dyno. We're going to show you how the dyno works, look at how we break in an engine, how we tune it up, and of course, how to judge whether the engine is any good or not. All of that this time on Engine Masters. Now, let me tell you about this lovely engine that is going to be the victim of this episode. This is the COVID 350. You've probably seen it on my social media. You may have even seen it on an episode of Roadkill where we did sort of a working from home deal with me and Finnegan, and I assembled this out of parts that were literally left over in my garage, which I know looks really greedy, but this represents 30 years of hoarding parts. Let me tell you what it's all about. First of all, it's a 355 cubic inch small block Chevy, very standard stuff. It's just got a stock cast crank, H-beam rods, forged pistons. It is 11 1/4 to 1 compression, which makes it pretty good. And it allowed me to do things like install a big solid roller cam. It's a Comp Cam's off the shelf unit. The duration at 50 is 242, 248. I've got rocker arms on it with a 1.65 to 1 ratio for 600 lift, which makes it good because you can walk around going, I got 600 lift. Now the cylinder heads you should recognize because they've been on that 383 small block that you've seen on a cajillion episodes of Engine Masters. They're the Blueprint Engines 210cc CNC ported heads. Up top, Holley 850 double pumper that just really stabbed my hand on that vent. That really hurt. And I've got an Edelbrock Super Victor intake manifold on it, MSD ignition. We've already got the dyno headers on this thing, and it is mounted to the dyno cart. And we've got the special flywheel installed, which I will show you once we get inside the room and take you behind the scenes on this dyno test. Let me get this thing out of here. One of the things you got to pay attention to is not knocking the engine off the cart, because right now it's not actually attached at the back. So first of all, why would you even want to dyno test your engine? Well, first of all, because it's really fun. I guess one of the big deals for me is if you have a brand new engine like this, you can break in your cam. If you've got a flat tappet cam, that's huge. But you can also make sure nothing's gonna break before you put it in the car. Leak checking is a really big thing. And of course, you can get a baseline tune-up for both your ignition timing and your carburetor or EFI. And of course, you get to walk away with the horsepower number and brag to all your friends that you have dyno proven power. When you bring your engine in, you want it to be as complete as possible. Once you get your engine here at the shop, it'll get mounted onto a rolling cart like this, which is super handy. You want to have motor mount brackets on it to hang it on there, and they'll install a flywheel that matches the balance to your engine. So if the dyno shop you're dealing with doesn't have that, if you've got, I don't know, a Ford FE or something that they're not commonly dyno testing, you want to make sure you've got that. They'll bolt on this drive plate that has a hub in it, like a clutch with springs, that's going to mount here to this spud that attaches to the dyno. And of course, there's a regular old bell housing, like a manual transmission bell housing, that's also used to couple it to the dyno. In our case here, you don't have to run a starter on the engine. There are twin starters under here that attach to the dyno itself, so we don't have to deal with matching that all up to a flex plate and wiring that every single time. But some dynos actually, you have to have a starter with them. I don't have a lot of experience with other types of dynos other than this, but there are some that do not require a bell housing or a flywheel, and they have more of sort of a drive shaft situation and different methods of mounting the engine to the cart. So you can ask those questions before you go to the dyno shop. So they've pre-leveled the thing, because one of the deals is it's got to go in this way, but it's also got to be leveled up and down, and it can't be like this. We used to fight with this a whole lot more. And Brulet's the only guy who sticks his arm in the bell housing and has the trust that nobody's gonna wiggle the engine and pinch his finger off.
As David was explaining kind of the rear of the drive system, the flywheel and all that, we've now slid it onto the input shaft, which is just not dissimilar to like an old Muncie 1 3/8 10 spline. What we have here is a water brake or an absorber, which basically is for lack of a better term, it's a variable speed torque converter. It's controlled with a servo on the bottom, which either holds or releases water to maintain engine RPM and load. What we're doing is measuring torque with what's called a strain gauge or a load cell, and basically what it is kind of an electronic rubber band which changes in millivolts. So it's actually calibrated, and then we actually measure torque. And between torque and RPM, we calculate horsepower. So there are observed channels and measured channels. Basically, this is the brain of the thing back here, this control box. We're monitoring fuel pressure and oil pressure, all of those things. But the meat of any engine dyno is really measuring torque, engine speed, which calculates to horsepower. All the other stuff is kind of things to look at the health of the engine or the potential of the engine.
So he's hooking up the oil pressure, I'm hooking up the fuel lines. You can see that we have both an A and a B fuel line here, and you'll often see Steve looking at the fuel flow on each bowl to sort of judge what's happening with the jetting in each end. So all of the water stuff that we deal with all the time, I never know what valves you're opening and closing and what the huge tank does outside and the heat exchanger and all that stuff.
Well, as far as the stuff I'm adjusting on the capacity valve and that sort of thing, it's really to kind of contour the absorber to the power output of the engine, because that electronic servo only has a certain amount of sweep. And so I'm basically increasing...
The servo being the dump, basically?
Yeah, the dump, the electronic dump that's controlled by the computer.
The releasing the water out of the torque converter, so to speak.
So what I'm doing with that capacity valve back there is kind of contouring the ability of the absorber for more or less torque, which is more or less water, because we want to keep that servo in a sweeping range for the RPM range we're running it. And so I basically reduce the water or increase the water for engine torque.
This is actually the Westech Super Custom Stainless Steel handmade water tank. It's got a radiator cap that goes here up on the top. And then this is a water-to-water heat exchanger. So there's tubes that run inside the thing and water that goes around the outside of it. And so you got cool water from the giant tank, and then you've got water out of the engine. And it works like a water-to-water or an air-to-water intercooler, basically, except for it's water-to-water.
This is one of the fuel turbines. Basically what it is, it's a little paddle wheel inside of this housing, and it has an optical pickup. So as that paddle wheel spins, it's actually counting. And so as the fuel passes through and goes up to the B turbine, we're able to count the fuel in pounds per hour and actually ultimately calculate that into gallons if we want to. What we're able to do is we have an A turbine and a B turbine, which allows us to read the primary and secondary bowl of a single 4-barrel carburetor, or primaries and secondaries in, let's say, a tunnel ram carburetor. What that allows us to do is make sure that we're not rich on the front, lean on the back, or left and right with a tunnel ram, those sorts of things. It's just another piece of the equation for data that we can look at to help us tune.
Steve showed you about the fuel flow and how that's measured. Also, fuel pressure is internal to the dyno. Some of the instrumentation that we do that involves the engine, well, this is dyno. We deal with water temperature here. That's what this is reading. We've got oil pressure hooked up just like you normally would with your autometer gauge on your dash. It just connects to the dyno. We also have a wideband oxygen sensor here. Sometimes we'll run 8 of them in every single header tube, so we can look at the air-fuel ratio cylinder to cylinder. On a standard deal like this, we'll just put 1 of them in a collector. It's obviously about 18 inches back from the opening so it doesn't get oxygen contaminated. And speaking of contamination, the other thing is if we have a brand new engine that's never run before, especially if it's a customer that Steve doesn't trust, like, you know, Dulcich or somebody like that, we'll not put the oxygen sensor in for initial fire up just so that it doesn't get wet with water, oil, overly rich mixture, any kind of disaster. This is run before and it's already broken in. So we will start with this all hooked up. I can never find the plugs once they're thrown over. That's why we need Troy. Watch this. Hey, Troy. See? Pork chop's good that way.
One of the other pieces of equipment that we frequently use, and we have actually in past episodes when we're trying to kind of figure out why an engine makes more or less horsepower and we're looking at airflow. Basically what this is, it's a little generator and it measures airflow down through the carburetor. And then again, it's calibrated to the electronics on the dyno, but it's got this aluminum honeycomb, a little fan there, and it actually, as air is moving through the carburetor, it spins the little fan. And again, it's calculated. We don't hardly ever, well, we did once, use this when we were running nitrous, and we don't any longer because this is really very fragile honeycomb to kind of direct the air and make sure that it's straight and the fan operates properly. But any sort of backfire or anything can damage this thing really easily. So this is really more like development sort of stuff, not necessarily having to run it on every engine every day.
Okay, Steve, before we fire this thing up, what are like the most common questions that you get from new customers or people who show up here for the first time?
I'll get emails that say, how much does it cost to dyno my engine? A little more information, please.
Okay.
You know, a lot of times things will come over the internet and it's very vague, and there's a lot more to it than that. I mean, I really want to talk to someone on the phone. I want to ask them about water pump and configuration and pulleys and whether it's EFI or carbureted.
Blown, turbo, some crazy contraption with 2 blowers and 3 turbos.
E85 or gasoline, all the way down to the point of, if you're bringing your headers, have they recently been coated?
Right.
Or are they seasoned? Because does it have a flat tappet? Does it have a roller? I mean, all of those things play one part to the other, so.
So on the header coating, if you break in the engine with a fresh set of coated headers, it bakes it off, right?
Now it's a bubbled coated header.
It completely ruins it. That's something I wouldn't have ever even considered for this,
Yeah, you have to season them, and you can't season them with a flat tappet very well, so. We'll use our headers first, break the camshaft in, then put their headers on after the camshaft's broke in to season their header, and then run it with their headers.
Do you recall ever getting this kind of care?
Oh, all the time. But I'm kind of curious, have you ever had someone come in so underprepared that you had to send them home, or?
It's worse than he ever has been.
I mean, the worst one I remember is I had a short block. Outside, when you came in, I was sitting on the curb porting the heads and had to get the thing tested that day.
Okay, so you want to walk us through what you would be doing for an initial break-in thing? You want to go start it and show what Troy's going to work on and et cetera?
Sure, absolutely.
Walk us through as if we're ignorant, because as you know,
well,
we're not.
Troy's out in the cell, which he normally is on startup, and we're going to check for any sort of fuel leaks initially. We're going to crank it for oil pressure before we start it. We're just going to check some real basic stuff. And then upon startup, he's going to do a walk around and inspection. He's got a heat gun in his hand, so he can go ahead and check and make sure we've got temperature in all 8 cylinders. He'll take a listen to the valve train, and then he'll go ahead and check timing for me. And we kind of have, we've been doing this long enough together, we've kind of got a hand signal program worked out, so we really don't have to talk to each other much.
Brule, being old that he is, he's hard at hearing, so we have to use hand signals. So what's going to happen is when Steve is in there and getting ready to fire it up, I will be ready with the temp gun and check the temperature of each cylinder and make sure they're all firing right.
This engine happens to have a solid roller camshaft, so my typical procedure would be to just start it up, make sure that we have base timing set. I'm going to warm it up to kind of test temperature, and then we're going to shut it off, and I'm going to go out and relash the valves after initial startup, just so I'm comfortable with that. Once we come back in, I'll run it through a break-in cycle, and then we'll start along our test procedure. So I can show you what some of that stuff looks like. And all we're doing right now is just letting it get up to some sort of reasonable operating temperature. It doesn't have to be 160 or 80. If it were a circle track engine, we would run it much warmer. This happens to be kind of a street and drag race engine, so we're gonna actually run it in the 130-ish range. And so this is at about the point in time where I would just shut it off and go out and relash the valves just to make sure that we've got some temperature in it. They're all adjusted accurately. Okay, so we've got the valves lashed, and now I've come back into the console. One of the things that I think is interesting, and it's a story I like to tell, is, you know, people say, well, why do I want to break it in, or how does that work by cycling the engine up and down and varying the RPM range? In the old days, somebody would tell you that you wanted to break it in by just going on a drive where it was kind of up and down hills and varying the throttle position. But I had an opportunity to look at a big block Chevrolet that someone had forgot to put an oil ring spacer in. It was a Stroker 496. And during the break-in cycle, I could see the engine smoke out of the passenger side header. And as the RPM increased, the smoke would go away. It would get to a little higher level, and it would smoke out the driver's side. So I was actually able to kind of visually see externally how the oil kind of fanned through the engine. So the whole idea was to keep the camshaft lubricated, to keep oil on the cylinder walls while they're seating, and to keep everything lubricated. So it was just kind of fun to be able to see what's actually happening inside the engine during the break-in process. So we'll go ahead and get it started up and run it through a break-in. Just gently bump it up to 3,100, and it's going to cycle it from 31 down to 27, back up to 31. Okay. We've run this engine before with a different carburetor. In the interim, we've changed carburetors because David's actually going to put this in a car, and this is the carburetor he'd like to run. Even just trying to bring it up to an RPM and load to break it in, the air-fuel ratio is so lean, we can't continue. And that's part of why you take things in small steps. We're gonna have to go out and address the carburetor issue a bit and upjet the primary circuit on the carburetor just to get the thing to cruise smoothly and to be able to run through the break-in process. This has a 72 jet in it. Typically I see 80 to 82 jets in these. I'm putting a 79 in it just to give it some fuel, and we'll I'm sure probably have to readjust some from there, but we just got to be able to make it run and not be so lean that it stumbles and runs hot.
Another thing that can make it lean like that is a really radical vacuum leak, which, by the way, on the dyno doesn't seem to matter at wide open throttle at all, but it'll affect like the drivability and the idle and stuff like that. So as soon as we ran out here, I started to look and see if the carburetor was missing any plugs. The one in the back was cracked, so is this one in the front. So that wasn't the problem, the jetting was the problem, but nonetheless, that's the type of thing that you can find out before you get the engine in the car.
Well, we got one full pull under our belt now. We ran it from 35 to 6,500. I can tell you that the engine's healthy. It's got a couple of little tune-up things that I think can be improved on, but before I go any further, since this thing belongs to David, and I always like Steve's opinion, I think I'm gonna go out there and talk it over with those guys.
The best part of this is I think Dulcich is really gonna like it.
I do like it already from
Really?
what I've seen.
Oh,
Yeah.
you've been watching the data?
Oh, you bet I have.
I knew you'd appreciate it.
Yeah.
Let's have a look and see where we need to go. Really, the power is still on a little bit of a climb. We stopped at 6,500 RPM, and right there we're making 502.9 horsepower. So obviously that crests that 500 goal and only gets better from here. As far as torque, and we are looking at corrected numbers here, which Steve will explain in a minute, 442.7 at 4,800 RPM. So our spread, and we often look at this, the spread between the RPM at peak torque and the RPM at peak horsepower is 4,800 all the way up to 6,500. So that's an 1,800 RPM spread, which is good.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
really good.
Yeah.
Kinda what we typically see in LS stuff that's good.
Yeah. No, we really like to see that because it basically means the package is working.
Yeah.
It's not very what we would call peaky. Like if you saw the spread from 5,800 to 6,500, that's an engine that's only operating in that
Yeah.
range, whereas this thing's fairly happy throughout the entire curve.
Yeah, it's a beautiful curve.
Yeah.
This is kind of almost an ideal situation when I look at an initial break-in and some testing. It's a little bit rich, not horrible.
So you say it's a little bit rich. We're looking at air-fuel ratio, which is the mixture of air and fuel as measured by the oxygen sensor in that tailpipe that I showed you, or in that header collector. And it starts out at 11.5 to 1 and ends up at about 12 to 1. We would call that rich because we're gonna target this thing later at 12.5 to 1 to 12.7 to 1.
What I generally do is on a normally aspirated engine is my target is horsepower. Wherever it makes the best power is the right air-fuel ratio. And I will sometimes see that at 12.2 and I'll sometimes see it at 12.8.
Okay, fair
So
point.
we're just gonna let the engine tell us what it wants.
Let me ask you this, when we start doing our timing sweeps, do you ever see timing affect the air-fuel ratio?
Slightly, not nearly as much as people think. I mean, they think as soon as you add timing, it's gonna get a whole bunch leaner. We might see it move a tenth or two, but I'm not gonna see big swings in air-fuel ratio.
Okay.
The other thing I like here is the oil pressure. It's got a really nice curve all the way up. And we were looking at that as we kept moving up in RPM, making sure all of those things were right.
So as far as the fuel mixture, we talked about air-fuel ratio. The other thing Steve looks at for drivability and just sort of the overall happiness of the carburetor is fuel flow in pounds per hour into the front and rear bowls individually. What are you seeing there?
Well, what can happen is the air-fuel ratio can look like it's in a good range, but the front of the engine could be extra lean and the back of the engine extra rich, but it averages out to appear to be okay. So with this, I'm verifying that it has equal fuel flow in the front and rear. In a perfect situation, you would have good drivability, good wide open throttle, and at wide open, those would be well balanced. That's a perfect situation. We get close. This thing looks really encouraging here. We're only a couple of pounds off. And we know it's rich, and we know it's rich at cruise, so we're gonna be able to lean the whole carburetor out a little bit.
So tell me what we're gonna do next.
2 and 2.
2 and 2. Yeah, back at Chuck Willery. I remember that. I'm thinking we take 3 and 3 out. You know, just something to get us closer. On this size carburetor, generally 4 jets out of the front and the rear will knock about a ratio out of it. So I don't want to get too greedy right away. Well, 2 is fine, 2 or 4. Get it into a range where I think the timing will actually make some effect, and then make that 1 jet change, then we'll do a timing change, then go back and finish it off with jet again. And I think you got a package.
Okay, watch this. Have you noticed Dulcich hasn't had much camera time in this episode yet?
I know.
Yeah, so he should probably go change those jets.
Oh, wow, you're just putting me to work, Frank.
I always find a way.
He's so benevolent. Well, as it turns out, the air-fuel ratio numbers appear to look like they're in a better spot, but it actually lost about 4 or 5 horsepower. So, like we had talked about earlier, is we kind of just let the engine tell us what it wants, and sometimes they want to be richer. So we're going to go back to the jetting, so it's very similar to what it was, richen it up just a little bit, and then go ahead and chase the timing.
The carb's fully dialed in now, and the next step is going to be taking a look at the timing. We had a base setting very conservatively at 32 degrees, so we're going to bump that up to 34 and then test it again and see if it picks up any power. If it picks up a lot, we may even go further to 36 until it stops giving us an improvement. So I'll just give the distributor a little twist, and then I'll give it a check with the timing light.
Now we're ready to look at some data. To review, we ended up first dialing in our fuel curve and then going to the ignition timing. So let's look at what we learned there.
So this is actually after changing the primary jet because it wouldn't even run to break it in.
Right, fair point.
So we added some fuel there. So we were a little closer than it may have been, but we couldn't run it the way it was. And so that's what we had there.
Okay, so let's compare that with what we ended up with our fuel curve. And I will say our jet changes on this thing were, after that initial step where it was way too lean, we were talking tiny. We never change 1 jet number at a time in a Holly, like for example, from 72 to 73, but we did that today, which was kind of dumb, but it worked.
Okay.
There you go. Big difference just from a couple of jet numbers right there. So that's one of the reasons why you want to come to the dyno. You've now got a baseline. I have found that when you take the engine off the dyno and put it in a car, you don't necessarily get the same results. It's not going to track the same air-fuel ratio numbers because of underhood heat, what you've got for an air cleaner,
Exhaust.
scoop, exhaust. Yeah, when you put an exhaust system on it, it tends to like richen it up, all those things. But it gives you a point to start from.
Yeah, and it depends on the application too. I mean, when we do some of the drag boat stuff, it comes off the dyno, goes in and never gets touched, and they're pretty much spot on. But again, they have the same fresh air, open headers. It's a much more similar situation. So anytime you change other components, mufflers, exhaust system under the hood temp, air filters, air cleaners, that type of thing, it's going to change some of the results.
So now let's just look at our best curve after we adjusted the fuel and compare that with the timing that we were messing around with. And we did end up changing the timing from an observed 30 degrees to 32 to 35 and even 36. And it was really insensitive above 32 degrees. At 30 degrees, man, it threw away power. I've never seen 2 degrees make that kind of a change. As a matter of fact, I think because Troy initially set it up and then you were looking at it, I think it was a different parallax on the light and comparing the mark in a different place.
I suspect that we probably were looking at it a little differently because I got it right and Troy did his best.
Well, that's one reason why often we have a rule here. If it's your engine, you set the timing so that you can repeat it in the car. We didn't do that this time.
Yeah.
Although, you know, my crew chief here probably will be dealing with that engine if it ever gets in the car, so we're good. But anyway, we found the optimal timing for it, which is an indicated 34.
Right.
Okay, and how did that look? Not a whole lot different. As a matter of fact, it's down just a little bit right here, just from variance from test to test. But
Freiberger, I have to confess, I honestly think that's the difference between 34 and 35 degrees.
Yeah,
So 1 degree difference. And
Yeah.
it's virtually an overlay. That's within dyno variation, if you ask me.
Which is really another point, I think. If you go to a dyno shop and they run the thing a few times and they can't overlay a curve like this, there's a problem going on. That's one of the things that makes Steve great is he's like paying attention to not just the coolant temperature, but in his head, he's also thinking about the combustion chamber temperature, because you can have the same coolant temperature whether you just rushed a bunch of water into the engine and the chambers are still hot, or whether the thing's actually settled. And his dyno brain has got that sort of dialed in.
Well, it just kind of turns into muscle memory after this long, but you've seen me do it. Let the engine idle for a while so the combustion chamber temperature drops, even though the water temperature still reads the same. The combustion chamber temperature is lower and it'll make more power.
Yeah.
So you can play little games like that, and we try really hard not to, because we want it. We want every test to be a comparison. We don't want to just have random numbers. I love the engine dyno because it's so much easier to do that with the equipment we have than it is on a chassis dyno when you have even more variations.
And finally, the punchline we all want to know when we go to the dyno, which is what is our peak power numbers? And the COVID 350 barely breaks into that 500 that everyone wants to see. It's 501.9 horsepower at 6,500 RPM. And by the way, in previous tests, we ran this thing all the way out to 7, and it carries very nicely. And once again, the spread between peak torque and peak horsepower is huge. At 4,700 RPM, we made 447.7 pound-feet of torque. So now, you may heap the praise. Now, I understand these days 500 horsepower is no big deal, but what we do to look at an engine and decide if it's good or bad is more than just the peak power number, because a 500 horsepower 540 big block Chevy is worthless. A 500 horsepower 355 Chevy on pump gas is pretty good. So let's talk about how we decide that.
Well, I mean, for me, the number to look at is always specific torque. And that's because the torque that you produce per cubic inch just falls in a narrow range, and you can judge if you're on the upper end of that range, man, you're doing pretty good. If you're on the lower end, then not so much. So where are you at, Freiberger?
So what he's talking about is pound-feet of torque per cubic inch, specific output. It is 1.26 on this engine.
Okay, that's a very respectable number for a pump gas engine, for sure. Wouldn't you think, Brule?
No, absolutely. Kind of the number I use in my head a lot, and because I have seen a lot of engines kind of end up there that were good. And on an average, I would say some of the best pump gas stuff that's a true street engine, you know, 10 1/4, 10 1/2 to 1 with a really good cylinder head and a hydraulic roller camshaft, they end up, I mean, kind of a target for me is 1.25.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see a lot of iron-headed stuff down at 1.15, some pretty decent stuff, 1.2. So at 1.26, That's a
Pretty
really good number for
And
pump gas.
the specific horsepower output, horsepower per cubic inch, is 1.41. Also pretty good for something like this.
Absolutely.
All right, well, that was a lot of really technical gobbledygook, but I hope you realize on every episode how much fun we have going through it and sort of nitpicking it and discovering why power is great and what engines are good and what engines are bad. And on that note, I'm not satisfied yet with you guys having told me that this is a great engine. I'd like a little bit more.
Okay.
If you could just sort of feed it in. No, it's not
Very
that
good.
awesome, but it actually came out pretty good. It's a fairly good street 355.
There's no question it turned out really well.
I can remember being in high school or my earlier years, you didn't go to the dyno, you know, you couldn't afford it at the time. There weren't that many dynos around, as a matter of fact, but if you're an engine geek and you want to improve your game, the dyno is where you do it because you have all this data. You could get all that feedback. Oh, is that working? Is that making it better or worse? You get dyno brain brulee and your buddies there. And, you know, like the dyno is probably one of my favorite things. So,
Well, it is me too. You just made it sound so fun.
Oh,
All
it
we
is.
really need is beer. Can we work that out next time?
There's some in the fridge
Oh,
right
that'd
now.
be fantastic.
I'm
All
on my
right,
way.
we're out for that. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on Engine Masters. Up top, Holly 850 double pumper that just really stabbed my hand hard on that vent. That really hurt. Look,
That's sharp.
yeah.
It needs mechanical 8-stack.
Who's speaking here? If I were to call him and go, hey, Brule, on Engine Masters, I want to run stack EFI on this thing.
On a
he
pill.
would immediately be like rubbing his head.
well, here's my thing.
What's
okay?
our schedule? That's
What's
what
our
I'd say.
schedule?